Yes, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here as part of a program for CRES and for Ollie both in the combined program. Thanks to the Jefferson Unitarian Church. Are there church members here tonight? So yeah, great group. I was having breakfast with my wife and daughter. My daughter is finished at CSU. She's going to go to CU nursing school starting in June, so she's living with us and having breakfast. I said, anybody know a good Unitarian joke? And my wife said, do not tell a Unitarian joke. That's not any way to start. I said, well, then maybe I'll just go back. I'm a Catholic. I said, I'll just tell a Catholic joke. So there's this Irish woman who's Catholic, right? And she comes over from the old country and gets here and she becomes a citizen and she is just so proud that she gets to vote. She registers as a Democrat and she just votes a straight Democratic Party line. And, you know, she's on all of her old church members. They all are voting this straight Democratic Party line as Catholics. And then the next generation of the Irish, successful business people, doing pretty well, and her son particularly doing very well. He's a banker, and he registers as a Republican. But he still loves his mother, takes her to vote the first Tuesday of every November. And one particular Tuesday, he's on the way to vote, and he said, Mom, how are you going to vote today? She says, well, sure, you know, I'm going to vote a straight Democratic ticket. He said, Mom, if Jesus himself came back and he was running as a Republican for public office, you wouldn't vote for him? She said, why would Jesus change his party after all these years? Catholic Irish joke. So I think we're here tonight to talk, this is the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, and sometimes I get a little pigeonholed because people think that's just what I work on. And the answer is actually not that. It's broader than that. We do a lot that have to do with renewables. I did a lot of policy stuff as the governor of Colorado that was about promoting renewable energy, but it's really, in my mind, about advancing a clean energy economy in America. And so while I was governor, I signed about 57 different bills that are categorized as clean energy bills and decided when I was leaving office, and you have some options if you're a governor leaving office, I decided to go to Colorado State University, our land-grant university, at the invitation of the president of CSU, and to work on clean energy policy and mostly work on policy at the state level. Because my experience was that at the state level, you could do a variety of really important things and good things, hopefully that would be in tandem with things happening at the federal level or at the local level, but certainly even if things weren't happening at the federal level, there were still things that you could do at the state level and quite frankly at the local level as well, but our focus has really been with states. So I just celebrated my 6th anniversary at Colorado State University. I have this stable of analysts that do great work. We have a website, the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University. If you want to check that out, we maintain probably some of the best databases in America that focuses on the states. So we check every piece of legislation introduced at the state level, and we track it out all the way to where it either dies or becomes law. Last year, we published a website that we'd worked on for a year and a half that looks at 38 clean energy policies, renewables as a part of that, but also energy efficiency, green bank financing, a variety of different things that have to do with market creation, market expansion, market financing. And we looked at all 50 states and each policy of those 38 policies in each state. And we published what we think is a gap analysis that will say, how well has a state done in any one of these 38 policies? And then we gave states sort of shades of blue depending upon how we were able to answer questions about what they had done. And if you've done everything a state could do here in this policy, then you got 5 shades of blue. If you've done nothing, you have no shades of blue. It's all in gray. And so it is this gap analysis for states to be able to understand what they can do. It was funded by the Walton Family Foundation and by the Nature Conservancy. And then just this year, a couple weeks ago, we published an iBook for legislators across America that is about clean energy policy and is this really sort of cool thing that has all these interactive things going on. It's free of charge. If you have iTunes, you can download it. You can find where the link is on our site. So that's the kind of things we do. And then in addition to that, we work directly with governors' offices. And we work with legislators, we work with regulators in trying, again, to think about how to move a clean energy agenda at the state level. So in the midst of all that, I decided to write a book about it. I published it last March the 15th. And I'm going to talk about it because it frames a lot of why we do the work we do at the center that I run and why I'm personally motivated to do this work. The book's called Powering Forward. The subtitle is What Everyone Needs to Know About America's Energy Revolution. And I understand that's sort of a bold subtitle to talk about, an energy revolution in America. And I explain inside of the book why I think there is this revolution going on and why I think it's absolutely necessary. But the work we do at the center is very much about trying to understand how we as a nation move this. And so I'll just tell you, I was a prosecutor. I was the Denver District Attorney right up until 2005. I was term limited, had to leave office, made a decision within the next sort of 4 months after leaving office to run for governor. And I decided it was important for me to understand issues at sort of the deepest level I could. And we had a variety of really big issues in this state: transportation funding and healthcare issues and things that had to do with K through 12 education or funding for higher education. The list kind of goes on and on. But I became very enamored with the issue of energy, both opportunities to produce energy in a different, cleaner way, and what I would say the need to do that based on a variety of issues, not the least of which is climate change. So there is a debate that still is happening in this country about climate change and whether or not it exists and whether or not it's man-made. It's mostly happening in the United States Senate. And that is a joke. I'm glad somebody laughed at that. Sometimes I say that and people go, oh, okay, that's right, it is. And I've testified in front of the committee. The Senate committee is called Environment and Public Works, EPW. And the last time I testified, Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma was the chair. And actually my daughter that I mentioned, she was on a school break. It was the winter break. It was in January. We were back there to do a thing at the National Press Club to talk about a report we'd done for the White House to suggest how the president could move a clean energy agenda if Congress was deadlocked. And Congress is deadlocked. They were stagnant on ability to do anything on energy and environment. So I'm testifying in front of this committee on Environment and Public Works. And my daughter and I left, and she said, that was terrible. And I said, I was terrible? And she said, no. It was just terrible the way they talked to each other and the way they talked to the witnesses. They were asking you questions, and not really wanting an answer and interrupting you. And they were just mean. She said, how do you put up with that? I said, have you ever seen the movie Outlaw Josie Wales with Clint Eastwood? There's a point in the movie where Clint Eastwood says to this guy, there are two kinds of people in this world, and you're just not one of them. And that's kind of how you have to deal with, folks in the Senate that are debating what I think is this existential reality for us as a globe. I don't think it's just for us in Colorado with, dead pine beetle trees or aspens that, are dead and dying. I don't think it's just an issue for people in California that are kind of coming off of a multi-year drought and have had tremendous experiences that relate back to an extreme sort of weather event over multiple years that's very much tied to climate change. There's a variety of different ways to look at this as a country, but there are people around this globe that are experiencing already the impacts of climate change. I had the ability to speak at Paris. I was badged by the State Department, and my talk was the role of subnationals, states and local governments, in helping nations meet climate targets. So remember, we did all this, filed declarations of intent that at Paris, we as the United States did, but so did 187 countries. Barack Obama can be very proud, I think, of the work that he did to get China and India on board to file some very serious declarations. And so we were there to talk, I was there to talk about the role of subnationals, but there were 187 countries. And what was really interesting was to meet people from around the world. My wife and I, once upon a time, were missionaries in Zambia. We lived there for 3 years, from 1987 to 1990. We understand sort of the fragile ecosystem of parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are very arid. We understand sort of subsistence farming. And to the extent, the ecosystem changes, the fragile nature of that changes, that you go into sort of a bigger drought, there's a real impact. We already know that there are cycles about that, but the climate data is pretty good in terms of the warming and the influence of warming. And there are farmers in sub-Saharan Africa that will no longer be able to be subsistence farmers. And not only, will they not be able to farm, they're going to have to relocate. But so will the people of the Marshall Islands. So will the people of the Solomon Islands. So will the people who live in coastal areas, as sort of the water comes up and they're displaced. These are all people who will become climate refugees. This is a global issue, and it's a global existential issue. Because the globe will still exist, the earth will still exist, but how we exist with it and how we coexist with nature is an open question, and it's certainly a very open question for so many people who will be dislocated by the kinds of impacts that we're going to be visited, that we'll experience from having climate change and global warming and sort of the warming of the earth. And so I didn't know a lot about that when I was a prosecutor in Denver or the district attorney, but as I looked at climate issues and understood the sort of global issue of it, brought it back to the state, and then began to really think about how to link these issues of a different way to consume energy, both on the sort of the electric generation side, on the transportation side, really to think about buildings and energy efficiency to bring down the carbon profile, the carbon footprint of buildings, but also to think about it as it relates to industrial activity and how to really try and reduce industrial pollution. And so we began very much linking these two issues about clean energy production, about transportation issues, and what we could do to really provide for solutions at the state level that would help us address it. So for people who may not know, the United States, if you took all of the volume of carbon introduced in the atmosphere, the United States is the largest contributor by volume. So now on an annual basis, we're no longer the largest contributor. We were for a very long time, but now China is the largest contributor. We're second, India's third. India is moving up to a place where it could eclipse where we are and be the second largest emitter, with China as the first. China could come down, India become the largest, and we would still probably be somewhere around third for a while. But all of this knowing that we have to figure out how we decarbonize our lives. And that was really sort of what we thought about in the governor's office. I was benefited by a group of people who were terribly bright, thought about this issue, had a great deal of passion about it, but also by a group of people who understood all these linkages, that you could think about this and think about it in terms of sort of domestic energy. How do we produce domestic energy differently? What is the transition that's happening and can happen and can be accelerated from particularly coal to renewables, even coal to natural gas, coal to greater energy efficiency, how to do economic development around that. So how do you really understand job creation as a part of that? And this was difficult in part because I was also governing during the Great Recession. And then really to think about what kinds of things we would do to address environmental concerns, including climate change, but finally to think about this as an equity question. How do you do this and not impact poor people in a disproportionate way? Because it's actually pretty easy to think about, drawing up a clean energy system, and if you don't pay attention to poor people or lower income folks, it can be something that you do on the backs of those people, and you wind up having people who have a fixed energy bill, or they have an energy bill, they're on a fixed income, and it provides them with this difficult decision, because you never want to force them not to be able to buy medicine or food because they have to pay for more and more and more energy. And so we really thought about that way, and then when I went to CSU since then, we've been sort of about the business of doing that. Now, interestingly, most recently since 2014, we and my center began really focusing on the West and on the Clean Power Plan. So the Clean Power Plan is something that the EPA put together in draft form in 2014. I went to the Western governors and said, Duke University is convening southeastern states. Georgetown, the climate center there, they're convening the Northeast and part of the Midwest. There's a group in Minnesota, the Great Plains Institute, they're convening the Midwest. Nobody's convening the West. And the governors, 8 Republican governors, 5 Democratic governors said, well, yeah, we'd be happy to have you convene around regional planning for the Clean Power Plan. Now understand, the states were all pretty much having to do their own state implementation plans, but the question on the table was, could we form some kind of a regional cooperative agreement on how we might move forward with the Clean Power Plan, including even the possibility of putting in place a trading program. And we operated with Chatham House rules, meaning I can't stand here and tell you what people said behind closed doors. We had the leads for the environmental agencies for the 13 states. It's North Dakota, South Dakota, all the Intermountain West, and then Oregon, or Washington, Oregon, California. So 13 states, like I said, 8 Republican governors, 5 Democratic governors. We had their energy leads, their environmental leads, so their air regulators. We were convening the 25, really the biggest utilities or power providers in the West as a part of it in a separate convening. And then we do workshops where we bring in the utility commissioners. And the conversation, what I can say is this: it was really constructive. And there was so much common ground about the understanding that this transition was happening, that there were parts of it that seemed revolutionary, and that there were far more things that united us than separated us. And I was the facilitator. So, for me as a former Democratic governor, it was a pretty big privilege to be accepted into this sort of circle with 8 Republican governors saying, yeah, you can convene us, and we understand that this is the Clean Power Plan, and so we did that. A year ago, the Clean Power Plan was stayed, the enforcement was stayed by the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision, they overruled the DC circuit and said, we're going to stay the enforcement and let it go through the litigation before states have to comply with it. About 4 days later, then Justice Scalia passed away, and now the court was at a 4-4 place, but they had already made their decision. So I was somewhere and I said, if he had just died 4 days earlier, and they said, that's a bad way to say that, Bill. You should say if they had just decided it 5 days later, then it sounds a lot better. Like you don't, and I don't wish harm on Justice Scalia, but it was a 5-4 thing. It was that close, and 4 days later it would have turned out differently. And right now we would be in a place, and maybe not right now, but at least it appeared for us that, for the rest of 2016, we would be writing a plan that would be a regional plan to try and join these different state plans on the western United States, reducing their emissions. And understand, in the West, we have states with the 3 biggest targets for reducing emissions: North Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming. They were part of our convening. But we also have these states that are sort of way ahead of the game: Oregon, Washington, and California. And if you're in a trading regime, then the states that have the big targets for reduction can trade with the states that have the allowances, and you wind up being able to get to that place. So we don't have the Clean Power Plan. And what I want to do for a little while is talk about what we do have. And then I want to go to just questions and answers. So interestingly, in the West, what we do have is sort of a case scenario where we can look at the retirements, the planned retirements for coal. And if you look just toward 2025, about half of all the coal in the West is going to be retired in the next 25, 26. And interestingly, with just the planned retirements and without the Clean Power Plan, we would meet that first interim goal with those retirements. Now, what happens after that is pretty interesting as well. And there are some things that could change this, but it's very possible that with all that's happening in sort of the retirement of coal-fired generation, that you retire half of it by 2025, and with that next half, about 2/3 of that will retire by 2040. So that means 5/6 of the coal generation in the West could retire by 2040, and that's without the Clean Power Plan. Now, what's causing that? And that's a little bit about what I want to talk about, because it's without, there's this big pushback against the Obama administration, against what people saw as the overreach on the part of Obama, what they called it the war on coal. But quite frankly, what's happening to coal-fired generation in America has everything to do with market forces. And you can see this even since the Clean Power Plan was stayed, the enforcement of that was stayed, with utilities continuing to decide to shut down coal. So just last week, there was a decision made by 5 utilities who co-own a station. It's called the Navajo Generating Station. It's on a Navajo reservation, and they voted to shut down the Navajo Generating Station. It has a useful life out to, I think, 2045, but they shut it down because they can operate combined cycle natural gas. It's cleaner burning, and quite frankly, it's cheaper. It's cheaper than the levelized cost of coal and keeping that Navajo Generating Station operating. That just happened a couple weeks ago, and it serves as an example of what's happening apart from regulation, apart from the Obama Clean Power Plan. Sure, there's going to be an impact from what's called the regional haze rules. There's some rules that are still in play that have been there for a very long time, where operators are making decisions about whether to install new scrubbers to scrub for nitrous oxide or sulfur dioxide, or to do things that lessen the impact around ozone and regional haze, whether to install those scrubbers or just to shut it down and then transition it. In some respects, that transition could be to gas, but in others it could be to renewables. And it absolutely is in all parts of this country that operators are making those kinds of decisions. So, Donald Trump as a candidate talked a lot about bringing coal jobs back. And it's just not happening. It's just not happening. No CEO of a utility is going to sign off on building a new coal-fired plant in the United States. There may be, at some point in time, a technology that helps us capture carbon off of the smokestack and sequester it, or to utilize that carbon, but it lessens the carbon footprint. But for the time being, with the long supply chain of natural gas and with the price of renewables dropping precipitously, the influence of that working together, and actually the best long-term bet, installing energy-efficient measures to increase energy conservation, all of that operating together means it's really, we're witnessing the demise of an industry. And I want to take just a minute to talk about that, because there are people who sort of on the environmental side particularly demonized coal and demonized, the influence of coal. And I'm a person who thinks actually what happens to coal communities in America is a justice issue. We owe so much to people who worked in coal mines, to people who worked to build coal-fired generation. We built an economy in the United States of America that was the envy of all these other places around the world. You could argue that coal was very much a part of us creating a middle class in this country, different than so many other parts of the world. So yes, while it's a fossil fuel, while it has this really significant carbon footprint, and while we're recognizing in a way that we haven't before the impact that has on climate and on warming, we need not to just let coal communities dissolve into nothing and to become something of a wasteland. And that's entirely possible unless we pay attention to this, and I think pay attention to it as a justice issue. And think about what's that transition. So in the book that I wrote, I actually have a chapter called The Just Transition. Because I think there's so much about this issue that you can talk about in terms of justice. I think as the largest emitter of carbon by volume over time, that the sub-Saharan African farmer is a justice issue for us in America. That the people who, live along the coastlands of all sorts of different nations, the people who are the island dwellers who are experiencing the rising water, that they have, from us, they deserve us to think about this as what's the right thing to do. What's sort of, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, he called it, what's the categorical imperative? What's the thing that your value system tells you and your ability to reason tells you is the thing you must do? And I think that that's true as well for people who live in coal communities and how we need to think about that. Because it's 2017. If you think about where 2040 is, that's 23 years away. That's a little bit over 2 decades. That's not a very long time, actually. 23 years is not a long time frame. And we're going to see, I think, the continuing demise of an industry for a lot of factors that have nothing to do, actually, with climate change, or have very little to do with climate change. So that's one of the things that I want to say. The other thing that I think it's important is to note that we do have a federal government that appears to be, well, scary. What are the I didn't say that. This is being taped. No, appears to be pretty hostile to this conversation. And, so I know Governor Perry, and I served with Governor Perry when he was serving as the governor of Texas. And I look forward to having a conversation with him. I think in his confirmation hearing, he's left the door open for some things in the Department of Energy that could happen. But, we'll see. Scott Pruitt, who's just confirmed to run the EPA, is a totally different person than Gina McCarthy or Lisa Jackson. I mean, there's every reason to believe that Scott Pruitt could undo so many things that the federal government has done to address issues that have to do with carbon, that have to do with other kinds of criteria, pollutants. And I don't think anybody's going to do away with the Clean Air Act. I hope they don't do away with this thing called the endangerment finding that has to do with carbon and is part of our ability to respond using the Clean Air Act, putting together something like the Clean Power Plan. But I think that a lot of things that have happened that were happening because we were trying to address emissions, whether it was carbon or CO2 or different kinds of hydrocarbons like methane. There was a lot of things that were being done to address that, and I think we could see that stuff being peeled back at the federal level. But I don't think that's not going to stop the progress that we've seen in this clean energy revolution. The price of wind on the Eastern Plains is 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It was 9 cents when I became governor. We had, I think, 200 and some megawatts of wind. Not very much wind at all for the size of the state. We're going to approach, I think, with Xcel's most recent resource planning in this farm that they were allowed by the PUC to build. We're going to have 3,600 megawatts. So in 2007, we had 275. We're going to have 3,600. If you do the math on that, I think that's something like a factor of 13 to 14 that we've increased. And what happened when we built out this renewable energy industry to scale? An economy of scale took over and the price dropped precipitously. And quite frankly, we did it in many respects through a renewable portfolio standard. In Texas, they didn't use that. They had some goals in Texas. But Texas has 15 gigawatts of wind. And they have a great wind resource, and they have a great deal of clean energy, and it gives you some hope that a Rick Perry understands the business case for that and what it means to build it out to scale and to see prices drop and drop precipitously. And that's sort of the good news with things like wind energy in America, but it's also happening with solar. The price of solar has come down 80% since I took office in January of 2007. And these are market forces. Some of it had a big policy push, and there's still some things that are policy that's sort of making the way in a sense, but the market's really taken over. When Xcel asked to build another 600 megawatts and own it, the CEO of Public Service Company of Colorado would say, this is not about a renewable portfolio standard. We've met our 30% by 2020. We'll have that in place. We are doing this because the market dictates it. And the CEO of Xcel, who's the CEO of the multi-state company, they operate in about 8 states, I think, he said the best long-term bet in America for buying energy is to buy wind energy and to look at these opportunities in sort of Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado. There's a great deal of wind available. There's a great deal of solar available, and the price on both have just come down precipitously. Now, this is all in a context where there's also very cheap natural gas, and while there's great concern among a lot of communities about hydraulic fracturing and about methane leakage, when you burn it from the smokestack, It's 70 to 80% less NOx, 70 to 80% less sulfur dioxide, it's 0 mercury, and it's about 50% less carbon. So there is this climate benefit if you're capturing methane. If you're capturing methane, there is a climate benefit of transitioning from coal to natural gas. There's absolutely a climate benefit of transitioning from wind, or from coal to wind, coal to solar, but as we know, those are intermittent. And until we solve the storage technology problems around battery systems that can operate at utility scale, or household solar that operates with battery systems that are really affordable, we're going to have natural gas. It's part of our future. And I even, in the book that I wrote, I have a chapter about the future of fossil fuels and a separate chapter about the future of natural gas. And that can be a very sort of controversial thing to talk about for a group of people who think, keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. I'm one of these people that looks at this sort of pragmatically and thinks we're not going to keep it in the ground. We have to do everything we can to capture methane, and then we have to understand sort of when is the period of time where we may have to look at the end of natural gas. I served on a panel for the National Academy of Sciences, and these really brilliant scientists and economists would say that our best bet is to understand how to capture carbon from burning natural gas. The carbon capture and sequestration, carbon capture and utilization. For the real, deep, wonky people in here, that report is called Power to Change. We just published it in September, and it looks at nuclear. It looks at carbon capture and sequestration. It looks at renewable technologies and energy efficiency, and really tries to understand how we accelerate the market adoption of cleaner energy technologies. So there is this momentum behind this business of energy transitions that's happening. It's happening to some extent as well in the transportation world, and that's important because last year was the first year where emissions from transportation eclipsed emissions from electricity generation. And so we have to pay attention to that and pay attention to how that transition happens as well, particularly where it relates to electric vehicles, where it relates to the use of natural gas cars, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Those are all part of thinking about this transition, thinking about how we do it and how we do it in an affordable way, and what's the speed of change that's necessary for it. So the last thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to open it up to questions, is this. The good news in the context of what we're seeing happen in Washington, D.C., is that, first of all, states are moving on this. And it's not ideal to do this without the federal government as a partner. And this stuff is really complicated. It would be so much better if we were dealing with policies that were coordinated among the feds, the state, and local government. And all of the entities that are a part of that. But we're not going to get that, I think, for a while from the federal government, and maybe for a long while. And so let's think about the states. Well, the good news about the states is that it's happening, and secondly is that it's not partisan. So there's a Clean Energy Coalition, group of governors who signed off on this commitment to transition to clean energy over time. It's 17 governors. 6 of them are from states where they're led by Republican governors. So it was 4 once upon a time, but there were 2 races that just happened in New England, Vermont, New Hampshire, where Democratic governors either were ousted or one retired, and Republicans came in, and both Republicans have sent signals that they're going to be on board, that they're part of this clean energy transition. But you have governors like the governor of Nevada, the governor of Michigan, the governor of Iowa, governor of Massachusetts that are also a part of that, and they're all Republican. Then you got this swath of Democratic governors, and so that's part of it. And I think it's important to understand at the state level, it's functioning different than it does when you look at Congress, where so much of this stuff just breaks down along partisan lines. The second thing is local governments. Local governments are really important in this. And if you have influence in your own local government, pay attention. There were, I think, 161 American cities that had signed climate pledges. They now have become part of this international group of cities. Here in Colorado, the cities that have climate action plans, it's really important. So the city of Fort Collins has one, but they have their own municipal utility, so they can really move that. They can align their climate action plan with their municipal utility. Denver is not municipalized, but the CEO of XL will say, listen, they put in place a climate action plan. They're 20% of our load. We have to pay attention to that. We have to make sure that the resources we're providing Denver will align with their climate action plan, and because there's a big political will behind that. And so whether it's a big city or like Los Angeles, a middle-sized city that's smaller, or whether it's a city that's kind of a progressive city in a very conservative state, cities like Austin and San Antonio, both that have their own utilities, they're making a big push on this. And they're part of this thing called subnational, so states and cities. And then I would say corporations. We just wrote a paper at the end of the year out of my center that was about corporate purchasing, because this is really beginning to influence markets in a pretty significant way. Even in places or states where there's a slow policy push, the market is being created by corporations saying, we want to go 100% renewable. We want to purchase renewable energy or renewable energy credits. We want to make sure there is this market where we can do that. Google has purchased wind in Kansas and Wyoming. Google, right? They are part of a big group of companies, and I think it's over 100 now, fairly big or mid-sized companies that have committed to 100% renewable energy purchases. So pay attention to the influence of corporations. There's now over 800 companies that have signed off on a letter to President Trump to say, do not walk back on our climate agreement in Paris. And so, I had a lot of battles with the United States Chamber of Commerce. They were a barrier to progress in my mind on clean energy. But our local Chamber of Commerce got it. The guy that's the head of the Metropolitan Economic Development Corporation is now retiring, Tom Clark, but he was one of our best partners on understanding this link between businesses and this clean energy economy and the business environment in a clean energy economy. And so we pay attention to businesses. And the final group that I really am focused on and thinking about how we do this is what I call right of center groups that believe in clean energy and even in climate change. And they're there. I've been part of 2 different conversations where we are having discussions about common ground. And it's really so interesting because partly what happened in this conversation, I served until 2011. I left office in 2011. 2010 was kind of when the Tea Party came in, and the Tea Party had this mantra that they didn't like mandates. And they looked at things like a renewable portfolio standard as a mandate. Like, well, the electricity sector has actually been regulated since 1905. Ironically, first regulated in Texas, where they talk a lot about mandates. And what happened was they set up this false choice between the operation of a free market that never was and this opposition to mandates. So it's like, we believe in markets and you believe in mandates and we can't talk. And it's just not true. Because we do a lot of things in the electricity sector and the transportation sector through policy. But we don't want to ruin markets. You don't want to do something in the automobile industry that takes apart the automobile industry in America. We saw what the bailout cost in 2007, 2008 is that industry really had very big problems and very big difficulties. And so you don't want to do that. But there are a variety of things that you need to do as part of a regulatory scheme and not think about this as this total free market. It just isn't. If anything, in the electricity sector, we totally skew the market by not capturing the cost of carbon when we emit it. That's like a market perversion that makes it not a free market at all. And so what we've been trying to do with these folks, what I call kind of the right of center groups, is to talk about where we can agree. And part of it is to not let things sort of trigger our emotions and really say, you believe that clean energy, the building out of clean energy is good for the American economy. You believe that it can help us manage around risks, around threats, including, things that might have to do with climate change, and that, it's good for the business environment. It makes us globally competitive in a market that last year was $330 billion. Those are things that we can talk about in a common ground way that hopefully will have its impact. And, it's why the governor of Michigan passed a clean energy agenda, because he had people right of center explaining to him, I think, there is the business case for this. There's a lot of other threats, but if you don't want to talk about the threats, let's talk about the opportunities. And let's do that. And then, so just think about that if you watch the news and you get depressed about how things are going. Think about that. Think about states. Think about local governments. Think about those things that are happening because corporations are pushing it. And think about those folks who are right of center, who we have common ground with on this issue, and who we think there are places around this country we can work on this, and that we can find a way to have momentum. Momentum that's, like I said, is there because of market forces, but can be accelerated in some respects by these other groups that are all a part of this. And that's what I'm experiencing as the director of this center, and the conversations that I have around the country, and the writing and the thinking that we do, is that this is happening, and it has some aspects of a revolution. It would be great if the federal government were on board, but while it is not on board, we need to understand how we are part of moving it anyway. So with that, I'm going to go to questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a lot of people here and a lot of questions, so I would want you to keep it short. And to model that, I'll ask the first question.
To model that?
It's kind of a legal question. I always thought that the argument of the EPA that they have standing to rule over carbon is actually pretty clear-cut. And so I was wondering, do you think that a rational Supreme Court would end up deciding this the right way?
So, first of all, I think there's some different questions. It is a legal question. In 2007, there was a case decided. There was a tailpipe case that involved the state of Massachusetts, where the court ruled in favor of the EPA having the ability to really regulate carbon and regulate CO2. And although it was a tailpipe case, it's been interpreted since then that if you're looking at coal-fired generation, industrial pollution, other kinds of CO2 issues, that you have the ability under the Clean Air Act to do that. It wasn't always clear before that, because we talked a lot. The Clean Air Act goes back to 1970, passed under Richard Nixon. It created the EPA. They created the EPA around the same time, and the enforcement of the Clean Air Act at the time was a lot about what they call criteria pollutants. And think about sulfur dioxide, NOx, mercury, those kinds of things. But they added CO2 to it and passed an endangerment finding that involved CO2, something necessary to regulate under the Clean Air Act. So the Supreme Court, I think, is unlikely to reverse that part of it, to say that the EPA doesn't have the authority to regulate carbon. By the way, if you poll the voters in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, 5 pretty fossil fuel heavy states, the majority of voters in each of those states believe that the EPA should have that authority. There's this popular will behind this as well. But they could look at the Clean Power Plan, and the argument about the Clean Power Plan isn't necessarily that they don't have the ability to regulate carbon, it's that it's an overreach. Because what the EPA did was say, well, we're going to tell you what you have to do in terms of regulating the carbon emissions. You're going to have to either do it on a mass base or a rate base, but in doing that, we're going to give you some options to employ natural gas as opposed to coal, and you can do that inside the fence line of the power plant, but you can't do that when it comes to renewables. If you're going to build a wind farm, you're not going to build it in the same footprint, and so the argument is the EPA has the authority, let's say, to regulate carbon, and they can, tell these coal-fired generation what they need to do to regulate their carbon emissions, but they have to do it inside the fence line. They can't go outside the fence line. And when they first published their draft, it included what we call building blocks, and one of the building blocks was energy efficiency. And there were so many legal experts that said to the EPA, you don't have the authority under the Clean Air Act to utilize energy efficiency the way you have as a building block. In the final rule, they removed it as a building block, but said, if a state can show that they have used energy efficiency measures to reduce their carbon, we're going to call it an allowable resource. And so that's something that I think the opponents would still say, well, this is outside the authority of the EPA under the Clean Air Act. Now, what's really interesting about this is the EPA, no matter what they do, if they file a plan like this, they get sued. If they don't, they'll get sued. And so if they back off at some point on the EPA and write a rule that takes apart the Clean Power Plan and they don't begin working on another rulemaking, they're going to get sued by environmental groups, and they're going to be back in court, and they're going to have to appear in front of a federal judge and talk about why they aren't regulating. And there's been instances where they've been required to do something because the environmental groups sued them and forced them to do it.
Can you speak to things that you've seen, say in the convening of those meetings with the Western governors and other people, where they're moving forward with the restrictions, the ideas from the Clean Power Plan because of the business case?
Yeah, part of it is actually shutting down coal, and so this isn't just the states doing it. Understand, these are utilities that are making these decisions. They may be doing it in some respects in conjunction with states and with their PUCs, but it's happening in part because the utilities. And so if you're a CEO of a utility, you don't plan in 4-year increments, right? You don't say, okay, we have a new president, we can just shift everything. You don't do that. You have to plan in 20, 25, 30, 35-year increments. And I think Wall Street expects you to do that as well. Your shareholders expect you to do that as well. So some of the largest utilities in America are investor-owned utilities. And if you decide suddenly, we're going to build a new coal-fired generating plant, and even with low-priced natural gas, still some price volatility with natural gas, but recently not so much, with the de-escalating costs of solar and wind, with energy efficiency being a fairly cheap, low-risk way to build out, your energy systems, you're going to be fired. You're going to be fired. That's why no CEO is building a new coal-fired plant. And so utilities are doing this, and the states are sort of on board. Now, it's not all candy and flowers, right? It's still tough in some places. You have a state like Washington, where they're getting their coal-fired generation from is Montana. So Washington, the governor, Jay Inslee, card-carrying environmentalist, pretty much says, we don't want to bring coal across the wires, and we want to introduce legislation to keep us from doing that. Steve Bullock, who's a friend of mine, the governor of Montana, is saying that's going to really impact the Montana economy in a serious and a negative way. And so there's some tension there between these two states, one of whom was the exporter, the other one's the importer, and we're going to have to figure this out. We're going to resolve it. But states like Oregon went to a 50% renewable energy standard without the Clean Power Plan as a part of their thinking. California is at a 50% renewable energy standard. New York is moving toward a 100% renewable energy standard. States like Hawaii, Vermont, they have 100%, 80 or 100% renewable energy standards. And that's not with the Clean Power Plan. That's just them saying we need to plan over decades of time how we get to a place where we're in what I call deep decarbonization. And that's happening at the state level in so many places like that, including the West. In a state like Wyoming, I like Governor Mead a lot. He and I are from a different place politically and ideologically, and we probably see energy issues pretty differently as well. But I think he cares a lot about his state, and he's trying really hard to figure out what the future of his state is. He had, it's the #1 coal producing state in the country, the state of Wyoming, and his 3 biggest coal producers all went into bankruptcy last year. Some of them lost 90% of their shareholder value. So Peabody, Arch, and Alpha. Alpha and Arch have emerged from bankruptcy. Peabody is in the process. It'll look like it'll emerge. But he knows he has to chart a different future. And it's not about the Clean Power Plan. It's about having an economy that's not diversified, and your lead industry is going away. Maybe slowly, but it's going away. And so he has to think about the business case for things like wind energy. And that's apart from the Clean Power Plan. So it really is this fascinating conversation. It's happening around the country. We actually convened a group of states after the election and right before the holiday. We just brought states in to say, what's this going to look like in 2017? It looks like at the federal level, there's going to be a lot of changes and a course shift. And, states said, listen, we're going to keep moving on the things that we've been doing. And we're going to keep moving this agenda. And they may have had different reasons for doing it. But again, it was apart from the Clean Power Plan. And so much of this is also sort of the business case for trying to provide low risk, low threat energy and low cost to your customers.
What's your view on a Colorado implementation of a price on carbon? Would you support it, or do you think it's a bad idea? How do you, is it practical or impractical?
So remember the governor in Washington, who I described, Jay Inslee, as an environmentalist, he did not support that price on carbon in Washington because he felt that it wasn't sort of the right formula. Now, California has this economy-wide cap and trade. Economy-wide means every bit of carbon is being accounted for in a cap, and you have to trade credits to emit over what the cap is. If you're a producer, whether you're an electricity generator or a cement company or a car dealer, I mean, everybody that's part of that. And so that actually works, and it works for a state that's the 5th largest economy in the world now. California is. And so I have how authors say, I have a chapter in my book about this. I do. I actually have a chapter in my book, and I recommend that we absolutely price carbon, that there should be a nationwide pricing of carbon. The question for a state going it alone is what it does to other things in that state, and can you design it in a way that makes sense? So I absolutely think we should price carbon. My hope was that we would do it as a country. There were, I think, some Republican senators in Washington, D.C. who were ready to work on pricing carbon. So said some of my friends on the Democratic side in the Senate. There were Republicans. I don't know if they're still willing to do that. There's certainly not much of a desire, I think, on the part of the Trump administration to do that. The other part about the Clean Power Plan is that it very much was a cap. It had the ability to be sort of a cap and trade system. The cap was what the EPA had set for 2030 as the goal, and you could be trading. I'm in favor of us doing that. I don't know, I can't say today whether Colorado should go it on until you see it, because that was Jay Inslee's experience saying, I think we should do this, and then they drew it up without his administration sort of approving the way they drew it up, and he didn't support it. And quite frankly, there were a variety of environmental groups in Washington that did not support. I think the Sierra Club did not support the way they were trying to price carbon in Washington. What's interesting about California is Quebec, a province in Canada, has joined California in that cap and trade system. And there are other provinces that are considering the same. In China, they have, 5-year plans. In China, their next 5-year plan includes designing a national cap and trade system for the country China. They've already got cap and trade systems in 2 provinces in 5 cities that are sort of experimental, and they're going to still have to work out some of the kinks. But I think worldwide, we're going to see, first of all, we're going to see markets like this develop, and it's interesting, California's been able to attract foreign partners. The state of Mexico, the country Mexico, is actually trying to transition to a clean energy economy. And part of that conversation is, do we have our own cap and trade system? Do we piggyback on a cap and trade system that exists in California? What are the kinds of things? How do we consider that? So I think all of those things are part of a pretty complicated question, but we would do ourselves well if we could just price carbon. So in the National Academy of Sciences group that I was a part of, we wrote this document called Power to Change. So it's $82 if you buy it on Amazon, so you might also just download it on the internet, and which I think you have the ability to do. And our second recommendation was to put a price on pollution. It wasn't just carbon, it was to price pollution, because it's part of it. And it was interesting because, again, we lived under Chatham House rules, but we had a public meeting where a representative from Congress said, do not recommend pricing carbon, because if you do, that report will be dead on arrival when it arrives in Congress. And, I think we thought a lot about it and said, well, we're not the National Academy of Political Science. We are the National Academy of Science, and we're on record already twice as saying the most effective way to get our arms around climate change is to price carbon and to do it as a nation.
So I think we're all here because we're active, we're concerned citizens, and we certainly want to see this new energy future probably arrive as soon as possible. So what I'd like to ask of you is what specific 3 or 4 items you might recommend to us as engaged citizens to discuss with our state representatives and our federal representatives.
Okay, so 3 or 4 things. I don't know if I can get it down to sort of the 3 or 4 things, but the very first thing I want to say is don't leave out your local government. I don't know where you live, but if you live in a place that hasn't already formed a climate action plan, I'm really serious about how important local governments can be in this conversation. That's number one. The second thing is when you're talking to state representatives, refer them to spotforcleanenergy.org, the website that I talked about that's the gap analysis, or refer them to us. We work with legislators on clean energy stuff. We don't lobby specific bills, but we're kind of this idea factory where we help states and legislators. We're actually doing a legislator academy at Colorado State University with my center leading it, which is to bring legislators in from across the country, use this website, and have legislators think about it. Here's what's really interesting about this issue. If you look at sort of the growing awareness around climate change, and you look at where the majority of people are in believing that it's real, and really the majority of people in believing that it's man-made, it's a lot, more serious numbers if you're looking at Democrats or even unaffiliated than if you're looking at Republicans, but still, overall, it's a majority of people. But people don't typically vote based on this issue. So they feel about it one way, but they don't use that as an index for how they vote about it. And I'm hopeful that this conversation changes when people get engaged enough to say, I'm going to vote based on how you feel about regulating carbon. I'm going to vote based on how you feel about building a clean energy economy. So there's all sorts of things that can be attractive, I think, to both sides of the aisle. And part of this is to understand this transition that's happening and say, what does it look like if we transition? Is it going to be renewables? Well, if it's going to be renewables, we have to think about grid modernization. We have to think about distributed generation and what the role of rooftop solar can be. My meeting before this was with a gentleman who has a place up near Fairplay, Colorado, and he's pretty much off the grid with solar and storage. And it's been pretty affordable for him to be able to do that. And he's not getting much of an energy bill at all. And so he's very sort of happy with that. He has no hot water heater. He has just thermal panels. I mean, it's really interesting what he's been able to do with this and sort of make the case to legislators that this kind of thing is what's necessary for us as part of this transition. But to say that, I think people need to really impress upon legislators that they're serious about it. In Congress, it'd be so great just to get this to a place where it's a larger bipartisan conversation. There is now in the Congress a climate caucus, and it's made up of Republicans, Democrats alike. They won't admit a new Democrat until they admit another Republican because they want to make it balanced, and they want to make it something where they can have a discussion that really looks for climate, for common ground. So if you're a legislator, if you live in a place where you have a legislator who is Republican, whether it's a United States Senator or a congressman or congresswoman, then I would very much encourage you to communicate with them in whatever fashion you can. And again, make the point that this is this really serious issue and that we have all these opportunities to address it. When you're talking to people from both sides of the aisle, I think opportunity can be a key word. And so, approaching this as a business opportunity. I mean, we built this wind out in Colorado. So what do we have, 13 or 14 times what we had in 2007? All of it's built on private land in the Eastern Plains, and a farmer out there who has a wind turbine on his land is making $5,000 to $6,000 a year. There's a farmer down in the Southeast who has 100 turbines because he has a lot of land. He's making $500,000 a year the least value of those. And I don't think wind farms are without problems. I don't think they're like the panacea to all that we recognize as issues in our electricity generation, but there is a business case for rural Colorado that's a serious business case for our agricultural community in Colorado, and we need just to hammer legislators with that business case, both at the state level and at the federal level.
Thank you, Governor Ritter, and the Center for the New Energy Economy for continuing to power forward. You just always amaze me how you just keep moving the ball along. I want to ask you about something that doesn't come up much. When I think about the nation's power grid, I hear lots of reasons why, for environmental reasons, we should shift it. I hear more and more reasons about business motivators to shift it. But what about the fact that it's 100 years old and it's decaying infrastructure? How are our leaders addressing that?
Well, that's really a fascinating question, because it is a place where we hope there's some common ground with the Trump administration. They, both Clinton, Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump as a candidate talked about infrastructure and infrastructure packaging. So what you say is very true. So it's a 100-year-old grid in many places, not in every place. There are places where it's newer and more modernized, but where it is older, there's a threat to the infrastructure just crumbling. But there's also cybersecurity threats that are part of this and may represent a bigger, more immediate threat to us than climate change. Cybersecurity is this really significant issue for electricity producers. There was some question about whether the entire grid in Vermont had been hacked. It probably had not been hacked, but contemplating the ability to hack an electricity grid is really an awful thing to think about. And so we think that that's a great argument for, when talking about an infrastructure package, to not just talk about roads and bridges and pipelines, all of which are really important. And we have decaying infrastructure on the roads and bridges and pipeline side as well, but to include in that the electricity grid and thinking about how we modernize it. What's really interesting about this, the state that's farthest along in rethinking business models for utilities is the state of New York. And what was the precipitating factor to have them think the way you're trying to have us think? What was it? No, it wasn't 9/11. It was Hurricane Sandy. Because the grid was not nearly resilient as they imagined. Even parts of the grid, things that were off grid, generators that were themselves flooding, hospitals, other kinds of important public services that went down for days at a time. And Governor Cuomo said, this is not tolerable. We just can't, we can't have a first world country or a developed country like the United States of America, a state like New York, be without energy because of an extreme weather event, because we haven't paid attention to this. And so interestingly, there is the thought about central generation as part of grid modernization and higher efficiency and newer technology lines, a greater use of direct current as a part of that. But there's also thinking about microgridding. And microgridding different buildings, microgridding neighborhoods, so that you have grids that function sort of on their own and generating their own power, the use of solar and storage and other kinds of renewables, but certainly, hopefully, things that aren't as vulnerable to sort of big extreme weather events and that are built into microgrids where even if they fail, they don't fail in sort of this colossal way. The other thing about that is this is part of the justice solution for the sub-Saharan African village, is that the idea about microgridding in places around the country that have no access to energy is itself kind of part of that equation. And hopefully we at CSU have, in the building that I'm in, the Powerhouse Institute. It's called the Powerhouse Campus, and it's the Energy Institute. We built a microgrid, and we're building those microgrids out in a place in Ghana. We're looking at Rwanda and the possibility of Uganda. And we're one research institute. This is happening all over the world where people are trying to think out energy solutions like this. But the infrastructure question isn't just about big towers and big power lines. It's also about distributed generation and building out smaller grids that are smart grids and microgridded even. And hopefully that's a part of the conversation that happens in Washington, D.C. around funding for infrastructure.
Some of the extracting states make a lot of money on severance taxes from fossil fuels. And as fossil fuels decline, that severance tax is going to be reduced. How are states going to replace this? Is it a big deal?
So the state of Wyoming would say it's a really big deal because they're so heavily invested in coal, and losing the revenue that flows from coal mining is a part of it. I think in Colorado, we're the 10th largest coal producer, so we haven't really experienced that. We have experienced some decline in extraction around oil and gas when we went through the oil bust. That's sort of coming back. I think we pretty much were able to absorb what happened in the decline. It didn't decline nearly like the experience for states that have big investments in coal. But I think it's still a fair question. You know, when I was governor, I tried to remove a tax credit for the oil and gas industry and got beat really badly at the ballot. Got beat in the fundraising part of it as well. And, you know, we looked at it and said, so oil and gas in Colorado gets an 87% credit against their ad valorem tax. And just to give you an idea, Anadarko paid ad valorem taxes to Weld County a few years ago before the oil bust, $53 million. And so they got a tax credit of 87% of that, of what they would have paid the state of Colorado. And you know, I probably made some mistakes in running that initiative when I did. It was when we were also trying to reform the oil and gas rules in Colorado. But you know, there's a big tax credit that's available in the state, and oil and gas gets to partake in that. And so we don't rely as much on it as it might seem that other countries or other states do. I think the biggest problem in the near term is in coal country. And I think we're already seeing those states with the experience that they're having of getting less and less on the tax side. And if they haven't provided a buffer or don't have a reserve, then like Wyoming, Wyoming has a big reserve, but they're still in significant trouble. I think the really interesting question here is on oil and on gas, how long we produce oil and gas in this world and in this country particularly. Is there some place where it transitions out? It makes oil and gas people very nervous to have that conversation, because if you think about the realities of trying to cap warming at 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, then there may be a time where we are using a lot less oil and gas. Even coal, you know, as an industry goes away, but other fossil fuels are likely to face the threat of also having to be limited, and there may be market forces that take over, and states should plan for that. You should plan for the possibility that, you know, 20 years from now, the gas industry, if they haven't figured out carbon capture and sequestration, is going to be similarly situated to what's happening with coal, because there's going to be regulations on carbon. Oh, the question was, would it be wise for wind and solar to pick up some of that severance tax? And they actually do tax wind in Wyoming, and I think there's a fair argument that it's limited the amount of wind. Anybody here from Wyoming? I worked probably 6 different summers in Wyoming on pipeline crews, making my way through college and law school. And when the wind stops blowing in Wyoming, people fall over. I mean, it's just like that kind of a state. And so they put a tax on it, and it's really, I think in many respects, it's limited the utility they've made of a fairly serious resource. And so I'm not at a place where I think we should tax wind and solar. We're providing tax credits, and those tax credits are going away. I think there's every reason you look at all the subsidies that we use to sort of manage our energy systems and try and ask questions about what subsidies should live, what subsidies should die. But I would not be in favor of sort of taxing wind and solar at a time we're really trying to enhance the build out.
So what I don't understand is that with methane not currently being adequately captured and moving forward under a Trump administration, it's highly likely that methane will still not be adequately captured, and that we're going to see further rollbacks to EPA regulations and even the agency itself being dismantled. You know, why is the extraction of shale gas still being touted a clean fuel when there's no path forward for it to actually protect our climate the way that we need it to?
So I would say that in Colorado, for instance, well, first of all, you should know at Colorado State University, we have researchers who focus on this. And the Environmental Defense Fund had a number of research studies on methane and fugitive methanes, methane leakage. And two of the most prominent studies were out of the Energy Institute at CSU, which I'm a part of. And so we know a lot about that. And the answer to your question is there's a lot about methane leakage that's absolutely solvable as a problem. And you can do it regulating at the state level. So I don't think we've solved it completely, but I will tell you, Colorado has the best set of rules in the country for regulating it. And Governor Hickenlooper has done some things since taking office that built upon what we did when we modernized the rules. If you remember 2007, 2008, there was a pretty big fight for me to go in there and do what we did as an administration to modernize it. And then since then, he's done more on the disclosure, but really carved out an agreement with industry that's the toughest methane monitoring rule in America among the states. And really, I think you're right. The EPA rule on methane's the BLM rule on methane could go away next week. The Congress, the Senate is voting on something called the Congressional Review Act. And if they do that, what the BLM did in years of trying to put together a rule to really capture methane on public lands where there's extraction, that could go away. So your premise there is correct, unless people want to write your senators and have your senators vote against that. It's past the House, it's in the Senate. So the focus has to be at the state level. And what I would tell you, I understand sort of your thought about methane. It is 80 some percent or 80 times as serious a greenhouse gas. It stays in the atmosphere far less. It's a 4 to 5 year window where it's in the atmosphere before it disseminates. That doesn't make it good, right? It still makes it a greenhouse gas that we should really correct for. But there's so much that we can do with industry on the regulatory side to capture methane, to have them find an economic benefit from not just capturing it, but reusing it. And so we have had this seminar at CSU since I started there. It's an energy seminar in the fall. And we had the CEO of Noble Energy say, we really are about getting to zero methane. And there's a lot of players in the industry that are like that. They don't like the BLM regulation, but they're trying to get there. And we're not going to do away with coal and natural gas at the same time. We're not going to build nuclear out and have that be our baseload generation to supply power when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. We're going to have natural gas, and the most important thing for us is to, in the present moment, try and ensure that there's a climate benefit to it because we regulate it appropriately to capture methane, to ensure there's not seismic activity with deep water injections, to ensure that we're capturing methane not just in the air, but not allowing it to be in our water as well. And with wellbore integrity, we can control for a lot of that. What we found at CSU in our studies is that the EPA estimates in some respects may be low on methane, in other respects may be high depending upon where you are in the value chain, but that it's a few bad actors. It's what they called, our group at CSU, super emitters. And if we have the ability to regulate that differently than we are now, we actually can control for methane.
Well, with that, I want a big round of applause for Bill Ritter.
Thank you.